So thank you everybody for coming. My name is Peter Dutton. I am standing in for Lyle Goldstein, the director of the China Maritime Studies Institute, who asked me to give a warm welcome to Joseph Fewsmith, who's here today. He is the third, actually, installment in the China Maritime Studies Institute lunchtime lecture of opportunity here. We're very excited to have Joseph Fewsmith. He's from Boston University. He's a professor of international relations and political science there. Although he was educated in Chicago, he's a Chicago man from Northwestern and University of Chicago. Then he saw the light and joined Red Sox Nation. So we're happy to have him. His areas of expertise are primarily Chinese domestic and international politics with comparative politics and Asian studies as well. And it's about that issue of Chinese domestic politics that we're privileged to have him here to talk about today. He comes armed with having just finished an edited volume on the topic called China Today, China Tomorrow. It's a survey of many of the domestic trends in China, including economics and societal trends, politics, religion, social order, all of the different forces at work today within China and what that might look like tomorrow. He travels frequently to China as well. Every time I try to reach him, he's sending an email back to me in the middle of the night from my middle of the night, your daytime in Beijing or something. Travels frequently to China to present and to lecture there. But he's also, in addition to being on the faculty of Boston University, he's a research associate at the John King Fairbanks Center at Harvard University, and also at the Frederick Hardy Center for the Study of Long Range Future, which is at Boston University. So he comes armed with all kinds of credentials to talk to us today. As you know, the topic of the lecture is the logic and limits of political reform in China, which I think will draw a lot on this edited volume that we're privileged to hear about. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Fewsmith.
Thank you very much, Peter, for the very warm introduction. And truth be known, I did give up on the Cleveland Indians. And
that's good.
I moved on to the Cubs. My baseball history has not been great. Although the Red Sox have finally become a competitive team, this year has been a little bit disappointing. But the football season has started, and the Patriots have started well. And so hope breeds eternal. At any case, it's a real pleasure to come down here and talk to you. And this talk is going to be, I think, really, really different than the usual talk that you get. I imagine you get all sorts of talks about strategy and, those international issues, weapon systems. I don't know that stuff, and I'm not going to talk about it, and I'm not going to pretend I do. I want to talk about domestic institutions, the way the political system works, and particularly the problem of institutionalization. In the 17th Party Congress, 16th Party Congress, they talked about 程序化, 制度化. They were going to institutionalize the political system, and it made a certain amount of sense. Especially if you think of Hu Jintao coming up there as a, relatively junior leader, let's say. You reach the top of the system, are you considered a junior leader? He's formally at the top of the system, but he is still within a framework that has been set by his predecessor, Jiang Zemin, who's still at that point very alive and well and reasonably active. And it makes sense that you would want to follow procedures because to a certain extent that stops other people from not following procedures. So in some sense, there's a certain political logic to why he might want to institutionalize a system. And there's a lot of logic to trying to institutionalize a system if you look at the local level of the political system. And I will have to say, over the last 5 or 6 years, I've been looking a lot more at the local level of politics than I have at elite politics. I did a lot of elite politics for a lot of years, and elite politics reached a certain status. I think that if I wanted to understand how the system was going to work, evolve, I actually had to move down my focus downward to understand how the system actually works. And I'm actually trying, when I get time, to write another book on this and see if I can pull some of these things together. And so talks like this are great to get some feedback from you. In any case, if you shift your focus downward on some of the social order problems, say, some of you may remember a couple of years ago in Wenling, in Guangxi, there was a major public disturbance. And this one revolved around some young girl who went out at night with 3 politically well-connected youths and ended up dead the next morning. Rape and murder were suggested but never officially accepted. And out of the series of events that came out of that, suspicions over things, social tensions, at least 10,000 people gathered, went through the town, and ended up burning down the local Communist Party headquarters and the Public Security Bureau. It was one of, there have been a lot of these sorts of things. This one happened to have been particularly large scale, particularly violent, and fortunately it was fairly well reported in the Chinese press, so we know a fair number of details about it. If you look at the situation, although this is sort of an extreme example, I think it tells you a lot about the Chinese political system. These were local officials in a really poor part of China, poorly educated, not exactly a middle-class society type place, out in the boonies, but it's an area that had resources. Phosphate in particular, water systems that could be exploited in hydroelectric power. But if you're going to exploit these sorts of resources, you have to move the local population. And they apparently did so with abandon, and usually the local peasants don't feel as if they're getting proper compensation, and resentments build up. And this apparently, there had been a lot of, let's say, low-scale violence in this area, contention maybe, and the local political authorities enlisted the thugs, the local underworld, the criminal elements. They became sort of the front line of maintaining stability. Having spent a long time in Chicago, maybe I understand some of this background. At any case, you know, that was part of what was going on, was that there was a heavy use of the underworld. And of course it came out in the aftermath of this that the distinction between the underworld and the above world, the political authorities, well, there was an overlap there, as sometimes happens in these situations. And of course the public security was also pushed out into the front line, and there was also an overlap with them. So it's not a very pretty picture of what's going on in areas. But this was a political structure that was responding to higher level pressures to develop their economy as rapidly as possible. And these are people who are responding to the incentive to get promoted. I developed the economy at such and such a rate. Nobody's going to ask you exactly how you did that. They're just really glad that the economy is going up and you're trying to distinguish yourself among your colleagues. It's one thing about the Chinese political system at the local level, it's that it's highly competitive. There are not very many jobs as you go up that cone, and so the idea of trying to distinguish yourself is important. It also illustrates, I think, with very real clarity, the point that Chinese local political leaders really are not responsible to the local citizenry. I mean, that may seem like an obvious point, but it's an important point. They are responsible to the people who appointed them. And the people who appoint them are setting targets for them, you know, to promote the economy, to do whatever the XYZ goals are, benchmarks, all these things that, you know, these are real pressures. This is what a sociologist by the name of Rong Jingbun many years ago called a high-pressure system. And it's the high pressure is that you are being forced to respond to whoever appointed you. And whoever appointed you really means you're talking about a very small group of people, perhaps even one person. When you're the party secretary at the county level, you're looking for somebody at the township level who will do your bidding. And so that's a very personal relationship. It's not something that goes through a lot of procedure. That's what a lot of the reforms over the last decade have been aimed at, and I'll get to that in a minute because I don't think it's worked very well. So it's a very personalized system. You've appointed somebody to be party secretary in a particular area. That person is going to respond to you as a person. Not, there is an institutional element of this, of course. You're responding to the party secretary at the county level, but more particularly, you're responding to that person. Because what you're going to do makes that person look good, because he's also trying to compete to go up one more rung on the political system. And this means that you get a lot of what we would call unfunded mandates. If at the county level you need something done, you call your people at different township levels and say, I need it done. Where are the resources, boss? You don't ask that question. You do it. You find a way to do it. And if, in this particular case, a way of enforcing social order is to involve underworld elements, criminal elements in the system, you do that. And you try to get the economy to grow at a certain percentage. And of course, in other words, there were a lot of social tensions that built up in this particular area and then burst out in, this was June of 08. And I know you've read a lot about social order problems in other parts of China. My suggestion is that the system itself is actually generating these particular social order problems, and that they are really very difficult to control to any great extent as long as you maintain this particular system. What can be done to change these sorts of things? Let me talk about another part of China. There's a township out in Chongqing. Chongqing is not a municipality in the way we normally think of it. It's a big geographic area that encompasses 30 million people, both urban and rural. I went out to Malio Township. It was about, I think I traveled on the bus about 5 hours from the airport in Chongqing out there. In Boston you travel anywhere for 5 hours, even in rush hour traffic, and you're not still in Boston. In Chongqing, you're still in Chongqing. It's a big place. This is going up the Yangtze River, a lot of poverty in that area. Malio Township a few years ago had another social disturbance. This one was based on the fact that, particularly with there was a strong effort to reduce tax burdens on the peasants in this area, and of course that, especially as you get into the 2000s, where they completely eliminate the agricultural tax. Local cadres don't have any money. They don't have any funds. If you don't have any funds, you can't do economic development. If you can't do economic development, you're not going to get promoted. You're not even going to get your yearly bonus at the end of the year because people are going to write you lousy evaluations. Right? So you're going to need a certain amount of money in order to do the basic things that you need. So how are you going to get it? Well, in this particular area, they said, we've levied a lot of fines over the last several years. There are birth control issues. There's, I guess, what we would call zoning restrictions. You're not allowed to build your houses in certain places. Cremation, burial versus cremation. It's still a contentious issue in the countryside. There are these sorts of issues, and they go out and they basically write the peasants a ticket, say you owe this amount of money, which the peasants, of course, do tear up and they don't like to pay fines. So, okay, you're restricted for money, you want to go collect it. You say, okay, well, we've got a good reason. We've got to go around and knock on the doors and start asking for this money. They're not always polite about the way they ask for the money. They can go in and you can do things like seize livestock, furniture, any sort of asset, something that will compensate. And in this case, you built up a great deal of tension. And when the peasants learned that some of this money was going to go into building a new office building for the local party secretary, they weren't real happy about it. And they circled the place and wouldn't let anybody out 7 or 8 hours. And this office building, by the way, does not have indoor plumbing. It's outdoor. They have the outhouse, and this is a poor part of China. They do have wireless access, but they didn't have indoor plumbing. Cell phones work just fine in that area. The broadband worked just fine, but the plumbing did not. In any case, okay, you had a major crisis here. And the usual response is to call the higher level, this is Kai County, and say, we need some support here. They didn't have any cops in this area. This part of China was under-policed. Even in a good sense of the word, you need a certain amount of police, I think. And the person that they called, of course, has to be the Zhengfa, the political legal secretary at the Kai County level. And he just happened to have been a teacher in this particular township for about 10 years before he got promoted up the ladder. And it was sort of like, what do you mean? Lao Zhang is out there? Lao Liu? These are my old students. These are good people. You can't go in and bust their heads. You have to find out some way of negotiating this. And that was the thrust of it. You ended up at that particular time with a new party secretary who had been transferred in, and a secretary who actually was, I think, pretty open-minded and was trying to find a way of doing things. And one of the things that he needed to do was to rebuild some sort of an element of trust. He did a couple things. First of all, he sent all the cadres in the local area out to talk to the peasants, individually. This is straight out of Maoist practice, right? This is the mass line. They use that vocabulary. You're going to go out and talk to the peasants, and we're going to follow the mass line and build support up there. This must have been really, really uncomfortable for the local cadres, right? Last week you were out beating them up, and this week you're going over and saying, do you have any problems with the political system here? Is there anything we could do to serve you better? Well, yeah, you could stop beating us up. It must have been really uncomfortable, but if the party secretary says that's what you're going to do, that's what you're going to do. You want to keep your job. Local cadre jobs are still very good to have, as opposed to no jobs out there in the countryside. The other thing that he did is he seized on the idea of building a bridge, which this had been under study for a long time in that area. In this particular township, there are a couple rivers that converge right in the middle of the township, and there are 4 villages that are across the river that are particularly poor, and they're poor because they're across the river and they can't easily get over to sell whatever produce that they have and engage in whatever market activities there are there. So, and of course with spring rains, every once in a while you lose somebody who thinks that it's safe to cross the river. So there's a palpable need for a bridge. This is a public works project that makes a lot of sense. How are you going to build a bridge when the people that need to pay for the bridge don't trust you? If I give you money, I know that a large percentage of that is going to go in your pocket. So guess what? I'm not going to give you any money. Well, they went over to these 4 villages and went house by house and persuading people that they had the need, and set up a structure, which I'll describe in a second, not to abscond with the money. And they built support for 85%, signed their name, and said, yes, we need this. This went through a long procedure, and what they did is basically they set up a committee with 1 representative from each of these villages. and they handled all the money. None of the money was turned over to the cadres first. It was, you need 10 pounds of cement. Okay, we'll go buy you 10 pounds of cement and we'll build the project from there. This became known as, there's a number of different steps here, so it became known as the 8-step work method. But the essence of it was that there was this incredibly intense supervision of the local cadres. It became a local model that was touted by Chongqing, and it was supposed to be spread through the area. You might guess that it wasn't spread very quickly or easily, because cadres in other areas quickly said, what's in it for me? Nothing? I don't think we'll do it. And in fact, even in Maoliuxiang, where they did do this, a couple things happened. One thing was that particular party secretary was transferred out. The next one wasn't against this system, but he wasn't quite as energetic in promoting it. More particularly, as the tax revenues with the abolition of the agricultural tax really fell to zero, the only income was coming from the county, from Kai County. And so instead of really going out and asking peasants to pay taxes, and which shifted the power balance, right? You have to actually ask them, and therefore you have to respond to their demands. All you do is sit around and wait for the county to write you a check and allocate the money. So guess what? It's not being implemented in most of Maoliu Township these days. Just last year, a friend of mine was out there, and two villages in particular were building roads. And one, completely the old system from above, and you got it was expensive, poor quality road, the usual thing. The other, different township or village, was built with this 8-step work method, and you had the local peasant supervisor out there, and you get a less expensive, much higher quality road, but it wasn't easy. The local peasant inspector and the construction guy that were supervising the work got into fisticuffs at least 4 times, and the peasant ended up in the hospital. And it's not easy to prevent corruption in, well, I was going to say in China, maybe anywhere. But that's the sort of thing. The point is that the poverty of the area and the need to go out and ask the peasants for money made the township cadres, at least for a while, more responsible to their constituents. When the money flow is reversed and it's coming from above, everything sort of reverts to the normal position, and you do what the higher officials want you to do, and you can pretty much ignore your local residents. Okay, a couple of other, these are two examples are from Sichuan, Guangxi, poor, undeveloped areas of China. That applies, I think, to a lot of China. If you go, large parts of Hunan, Henan, Sichuan, Gansu, needless to say, Qinghai and other places would largely fit into this mold, I think, this general pattern. Zhejiang is a province, excuse me, very different. Zhejiang is south of Shanghai. It's one of the most developed, probably the most developed province in China, and its economy is based largely on private industry. This makes it very different than Guangdong, which is based much more on processing trades, which deal much more with government. The government is much stronger in Guangdong than it is in Zhejiang. Couple quick examples. One is the city of Wenzhou. You may have heard of Wenzhou, a little bit, some of you. The Wenzhou model was very, if you take off everything that you're wearing that is made in Wenzhou, I think this would be a very embarrassing meeting. They had 90% of the market on buttons, for instance. At any case, textiles, incredible. Wenzhou was a place that went from real poverty to considerable wealth. You may have just read the New York Times article, well, when was that? About 2 or 3 days ago, about the city north of Florence, where they're making Italian textiles. Those workers are all from Wenzhou. They're all from Wenzhou. Wenzhouese travel around China, around the world. In the Cultural Revolution, they were traveling around China, buying and selling things. Zhejiang Village outside of Beijing, that wasn't Zhejiang Village, that was Wenzhou Village. Largely from that area. They work hard and they make a lot of money. So they went from real poverty to really quite considerable wealth over the last several years. The last 20 years, and did it through what we would call private enterprise. They were not at first called private enterprises because you weren't allowed to have them. Gutihu, individual entrepreneurs, a lot of workshops. These are mom and pop. These are family organized workshops, and they would do, cigarette lighters. One person can work on the casing, one on the flint, one on the little wheel, et cetera, et cetera. So you can break up the production line. And Wenzhou, by the way, has more than 90% of the world's market of the metal encased cigarette lighters. At any case, this is the sort of thing that you like to see. This is the if you will, capitalism, sometimes a rather raw form of capitalism, really taking off and doing what it should. And there are 2 points that I would like to make. One is the Wenzhouese, because they became wealthy, became welcome in other parts of China. For those of you who have studied traditional China, you know about Tongxianghui, native place associations. Traditionally, merchants in one area of China have set up these, they're really mutual aid societies in other parts of China. Actually, I think the origin of them is when you went to take the metropolitan exam in Beijing, you needed a place to stay, and your hometownsman had this sort of association, would put you up, and so forth. But the merchants did this throughout China and so forth. The point is that the Wenzhouese now have over 130, they're called ED Shanghui, chambers of commerce in alien places outside of your Wenzhou. Now, if you look at the laws of China, it's a very corporatist framework, a nice vertical framework. They don't like horizontal. Wenzhou does horizontal. They have all these organizations all around China. Why do they want them? Well, they want the investment. And so you have a Wenzhou Chamber of Commerce in Wuxi and Shenyang, a very elaborate one in Shanghai, and so on and so forth. My argument would be that this sort of thing, while it looks very good in some ways, and you like the horizontal lines being formed, is actually the sort of thing that undermines and erodes the incentives to establish legal frameworks. Because what you have here is not setting up a legal framework. Anybody with a certain amount of money is welcome to come into our area, invest in a particular place according to certain laws. It's saying, you got a lot of money, would you mind coming, setting up your organization here? I think I can find some land to allocate to you. This sort of thing. This is precisely the sort of thing that I think in some ways speeds up economic development in certain limited sense. But probably the long-term outcome of this is to, as I say, erode the incentives to create the sort of legal structure that I think would support a more capitalist structure overall. So it sort of limits well, we'll put it this way. The system seems to be able to co-opt the Wenzhou model into itself rather than the Wenzhou model being able to undermine and change the system. Another point on the Wenzhou case is that it seems that having reached a certain level of development, that they're just not going to be, well, allowed to develop into certain industries. They can have very large industries, but not critical industries. You're not going to see the Wenzhouese buying into Sinopec or into major state banks, this sort of thing. That there is sort of, if you will, a cap on this, and they will be allowed to build all the hotels they want. They can make all the shoes or textiles you want. But into sort of critical industries, that's going to be very, very difficult to move into. And so this is part of the conversation that's going on in China now about so-called guojin mintui, the state advances and the private sector retreats. I said there'd be only 2 points on Wenzhou. I'm adding a third. I do that. And that is, over the last decade, they've been establishing party organizations in private enterprises in Wenzhou. And I'm not sure the bottom line on this, who's using whom, but I can tell you that people are being used here. This is great. You go into a big private enterprise in Wenzhou and talk to the party secretary. The party secretary is being hired for a considerable salary. These are not, low-paying jobs. They don't have to work on the assembly line. The guy I talked to was being paid at least 300,000 renminbi for a year. That's a big salary by anybody's standard. Who are these guys? Who are they hiring? Well, this guy, I've talked to a couple of these, had been 30 years in the propaganda office of Wenzhou, which is to say that he knows everybody that you need to know in Wenzhou. I'm going to give you a big salary. If I encounter a problem, I need you to call and fix the problem for me. The party gets a lot of information about what's going on in these enterprises. The enterprise gets to lobby the government. And what you have here is really, if you will, a privatization of public goods. If public policy is supposed to be public, reasonably unbiased according to rules, this is a whole way of gaming the system. And that should, over the long term, make these enterprises less competitive, not more competitive. In other words, there are two ways of making money, right? You can either earn it or you can lobby for it. And lobbying's a whole lot easier. Earning it is tough, but it's what makes economies, drives them forward over the time. So in other words, the Wenzhou model is, I think, really beginning to fade in China as a leading force of what's going on. And that's something that I think is a little bit troubling. Final case, I don't want to leave you discouraged. I want to give you a source of optimism. There's one other part in China. If you move up the Zhejiang coast a couple of hours by bus, I do recommend the bus. It's good touring. In any case, you get to a city called Wenling, which I'm pretty sure nobody in this room has heard of before. It's part of Taizhou, which you might have heard of, which is a bigger city. It's on the coast. Taizhou, by the way, is a major manufacturing metropolis. It's a very wealthy city. Wenling is a county-level city. Americans have trouble, I think, grasping getting their heads around the Chinese administrative system, because you can have a prefectural level city, you can have a county level city, or in Shanghai you can have a provincial level city, different administrative ranks for cities. We don't usually do that. In any case, this is a county level city, and over the last 10 years or so, they've been developing some interesting systems that open up the political system, at least to a certain extent. This started 10 years ago with something called Minju Kentan Hui, or democratic consultation meetings. And it really came out of there was another education campaign that was going on that said, okay, local cadres, go gather your peasants together and tell them whatever the message of this latest campaign was. And in one particular township, two things. The party secretary was a little ambitious, wanted to do something that would distinguish himself. You're always looking for getting that little extra edge on your resume. That's a good thing. And the local propaganda department wanted to do something a little bit different. And so they said, okay, well, instead of just getting up there on the podium and yakking at people, we'll let them get up and talk about their problems. And this was something that was really quite interesting because people apparently got up and vented would be the way I think we would say this. And you know, it was actually something that was very uncomfortable, at least for some of the cadres. And there was a lot of discussion about whether you wanted to continue or not continue this sort of system. And the local party secretary took a whole bunch of people, local cadres, over to Zhejiang University in Hangzhou. And they spent a whole night, evening and night, talking about this. And finally, by sometime early in the morning, late at night, whatever you want to say, I decided, yeah, we want to continue this. And so this is something like, you could say this is something like a public hearing, and I think that's the way it evolved over time, especially, if you're in a township and you say you want to build a road over here and you want to widen the road so it'll affect a whole bunch of businesses there. You call a meeting and they can show up, other people who support it show up, both sides, and you can hopefully talk these problems out. And so this has become fairly well institutionalized at least every quarter at the township level. They also do this at the village level. You have these sorts of things. Now the place that was really interesting is one of these townships is called Xinhejian in Wenling. They, about 6 years ago now, started to use the local People's Congress to look at the budget. This is really unusual in China. In fact, it had never been done before. Local township, People's Congress at the township levels are generally speaking pretty worthless. This is a way of giving people a title. They usually meet once a year for about half a day. Legally, you have to put the appointment of the local mayor and several other people through the local township. And it's pretty obvious the way this works. The night before you come in, you have to eat, right? You can't have a meeting without eating and drinking. This is something I do recommend to you. Makes everybody feel better. And everybody's happy, and the local party secretary would say something like, well, tomorrow morning we're having this meeting and we're going to consider so and so and so and so and so for these offices, and I sure hope that you'll support me. Well, after a good meal and lots of baijiu, who wouldn't support him? So the next morning they do that and they leave. Everything's settled. Nobody looks at the budget. And in this particular case, and this was influenced by some academics in Beijing, said you want to do something interesting, look at the budget. And in this particular case, you had a new party secretary coming in who just didn't have the local respect, if you will, of the local mayor. And he, in other words, he didn't have real control over his own budget. Local politics are always local, right? And relations between different people matter. And so he happened to also be concurrently the head of the local People's Congress. So he said, hey, this is a good idea. We can use the People's Congress to look at the books. And then I can control the budget and do this. So he had his own motivations for doing this. But the point is that they began to open up the books, not in complete detail, but not badly. The first budget in '05 listed about 110 items, and it breaks it down, local administrative expenses, even party expenses, even though it's a government budget, education, all these different categories are there. And the innovation was not only showing them the budget and requiring them to approve it, but particularly in '06 and '07, they began to make amendments. We'd rather spend more money in this area than in this area. Now, they're not allowed to fiddle with the bottom line. The budget figure remains the same, but you can move some from column A to column B. You have to draw up a resolution on that, and you have to vote on it. And this is something that now over 5 or 6 years has been going on, and it's expanded from one village to now, or township to now 6. It's been used up in some of the departments of Wenling city itself. So it's something that every year they have managed to deepen and expand. And so this is the sort of thing that does give you hope that maybe some of this institutionalization will take place, at least in parts of China. But I think part of what is going on, and this will be my final point here, is that what you're doing is sort of expanding and including the local elite. This is not democratization, it's not voting. It's very much a matter of, this is a private economy in this area. You've got a lot of entrepreneurs in this area that are quite wealthy. You're basically letting them, who are often the same people as your delegates to the local People's Congress, in on the governance of the local area. So it's more of an elite consultative function, and it's something that doesn't erode the power of the party. It's still the People's Congress system, but yet includes non-party people in at least some aspects of the decision making. So that sort of thing, maybe there's something going on, but if you're waiting for China to democratize, you're going to wait a long, long time. That's the bottom line, and thank you very much.
Well, we've left some good time for questions, and we'll take them in order. So if you have questions, go ahead. If you don't, I actually have several. But so, Dean Garofano, would you?
Thanks very much for presenting a complex picture. So just to follow up on your last point, how would you define democratization or democratized China, and why will it take such a long time? Is it simply a question of elite perceptions and that the laws will never change, or what's your basic?
Well, I mean, definition of democracy. I'm a good Isaiah Berlin liberal in that sense. If you don't vote, you don't have a democracy. You can talk about other things in terms of laws to uphold that and so forth, but I do take a one-person, one-vote system as meaning democracy. And so I don't like hyphenated democracies. Chinese democracy or something of that nature doesn't make much sense to me. You could, I think, have a more liberalized political system, something that isn't quite so abusive at the local level, that can be more inclusive of local elites. But I get back to the structure of the party, and beginning of the talk I mentioned that at least traditionally you've had a very small group of people, usually the party secretary, who might talk to one or two other people and say, who are we going to appoint? This is something that comes very distinctly out of China's revolutionary history. Those would be the local party secretaries, local commanders who are directing action in this area. So you have this sort of structure that comes out of the revolution. And there was a logic to maintaining it. If you say, as some of the regulations now at least put it, if you want to include more people, you're going to get more lobbying. And it's going to actually be disruptive. You're going to have more of a tendency to factionalize the local party system. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's been such resistance to doing this, because it really does have a lot of implications. So sort of the, I could see parts of China on the East Coast having these more inclusive, consultative procedures. I don't see anything even remotely resembling a more democratic process moving into the interior or even in that part. By the way, the system, this high-pressure system that I described at the beginning, accounts a lot for China's economic development. You have goals to develop the local economy. That is a lot of pressure, and so the system works in terms of economic development, not necessarily efficient economic development, because you get all these image projects and that sort of thing that goes on there. But it has produced a lot of the results we've seen. And one of the things that this system can do is they can select cadres that they think are capable. But they are always responding to the higher level, never to a larger constituency. I don't know if that...
I've got a question I'd like to address. I'll take the moderator's prerogative here, which is kind of a payoff question, which is that one of the questions we think about here a lot is this question of resiliency of the Chinese system, right? And you've described some sources of cultural resiliency, but you've also said that the system is the source of the social discontent. One of the things that I note is you mentioned as the officials have begun to include the elites more, the local elites more, the system is beginning to look more like a traditionally Chinese system in which the imperial officials and the local gentry had a similar kind of relationship between them. And I'm just wondering, well, first of all, do you agree that comparison, it just occurred to me, whether that's actually accurate or maybe this is something completely different. And the second is, what does this say about resiliency in the Chinese system in your mind?
I have to say I play with that sort of, I call it hypothesis, that it's looking more like the traditional system of, certainly the Wenzhou chambers of commerce in other parts of China look a lot like traditional China. The inclusion of local elites. On this inclusion of local elites, I mean, I was just in Wenling in July, and there was an academic conference. And if you look at the local budget of the township, there's no item for academic conference in July. This wasn't part of that wouldn't have been listed there. And where'd the money come from? Well, it actually came from local entrepreneurs. The city government called up and somebody, I don't know who, and said, by the way, we'd like to have 60 or 70 people at this conference. Oh, good. We don't mind paying what academics are cheap. This didn't cost very much. At any case, 1 or 2 nights in a hotel, a couple meals, nothing very elaborate. That's just sort of, the government says, gee, would you mind sponsoring a meeting? Sure. Well, of course there's going to be a continuing close relationship where I think that investment will pay off for the local, but it seems to be that sort of an informal system. And I doubt that in Newport you could go down to the local shop and ask them to sponsor a conference. Wouldn't happen. But so there is sort of that inclusion of building that's what I think the issue of, putting it more broadly, I think the issue of legitimacy, which has to do with your resilience question, is a matter of building elite support, intra-elite support, including socioeconomic elites, not so much peasants. They're still not on the agenda, except perhaps as an object of certain social policies, things of that nature.
Thank you.
If I could follow up with that question, then if that's the case, then does China slip back into the other traditional model of cyclical peasant revolts that go right at the heart of the power?
I'm actually, I don't know whether this is optimistic or pessimistic, but I think not. I think that there is a problem, a continual problem of lots of relatively low gauge local violence. Most of the problems that we have seen have been very much localized. You know, it is a matter of this local authority coming in and beating you up and taking your land. It's a family problem, it's a village problem. It's very rarely a township, much less a county problem. So saying, I have this problem, you do too, let's get together, this has not really happened. Maybe a couple instances, but not in a systematic basis. Over the next 10 or so years, you're going to see, what, 200 million peasants move into the city, and their lands will be consolidated, either willingly or unwillingly. They're still negotiating the terms of that sort of stuff. So I don't think you're going to, you know, they're going to be taken off the land, and I don't think you're going to have a problem of this aggregating into a traditional peasant revolt.
Follow on. You were saying institutionalizing. Is that institutionalizing a la, you know, codification like CFR, or are we talking like broad stroke constitutional sort of issues?
Institutionalizing.
What you were talking about at the beginning with the one
Yeah,
Chinese official.
yeah. To my perspective, China really has not institutionalized. And by institutionalized, to me, what institutions do is they draw lines. They draw lines. The most important is between public and private. I don't think the party recognizes that line. Deng Zhou used to use the term zone of indifference, that the state stepped back from society and allowed a zone of indifference. A zone of indifference is a lot different than I have the right to intervene there. I'm choosing not to intervene. But if you screw up, I have the right to intervene. And I think that that tends to be very much the case. There are lots of other lines that get drawn. The most important, of course, is in the legal system. And I don't see any tendency to move to an independent judiciary. You know, third-party enforcement, I think, is critical for the development of formal institutions. And when you talk about what's distinct about China as opposed to the West, I think these are certain areas that you should look to.
Is there even a formalized contractual law?
Oh yeah, yeah. And there are lots of American lawyers who make money doing this stuff. But it's not how the system works.
Questions?
Yes, sir.
In the countryside, what's the role of PLA, if any?
Gee, it's a question I've never looked into. I don't think it has a major role in the countryside. There are militia at the county and even township level. The PLA in the countryside's biggest impact, of course, is emergency response, floods, famine, things of that nature, recruitment, and of course placing of officers in jobs at, say, the county or township level. That's something that, you know, when you serve, some of you must be much more fluent in this than I am, so many years in the PLA, and you retire, depending on your rank, you can be placed in certain level civilian jobs, and the receiving unit really has to accept you. Whether or not you're qualified, that doesn't matter. And yeah, it's a form of retirement system. Is that better than going to private industry? No.
Go ahead, Don.
I got a question about local politics. You know, you talk about party secretary being the only person in charge. You know, to the point, you know, the person could make this very arbitrary decision. The corruption could arise. You know, traditionally we talk about even factionalism could be providing some sort of checks and balances. You know, for instance, during the Cultural Revolution, definitely you factionalism, different lines, you know.
Yeah,
So whatever you do, you might end up being politically vulnerable, being exploited by the faction of the opposing factions, you know. That provides some sort of checks and balances, you know. Also, the issue of accountability. You talk about, you know, vertical accountability, not as much as to the masses, you know. I think there is still a criteria, you know, in terms of 群众关系, you know, mass relationships. So that's one of the indicators. One of the things that the superior look into your record to see to what extent you could have good mass relations. I think that still matters. Perhaps not as much as in earlier days, you know. So in that sense, you know, my sense is, what are the checks and balances? There must be some ways, you know, to have some sort of restrictions about the power of the local party secretary. You know, definitely comes from up, right? I mean, the authority differentiation that provides some sort of supervision. I don't know to what extent disciplinary inspection commission, you know, has some sort of check and balances. The masses definitely don't seem to be able to, like early days.
I mean, you're right that the relationship with the local people, put in forms of social stability, is an important thing, and the center has made very clear that one of the things that you will be evaluated on, there are really only two things, right? Local economic development and social stability. So if you can squeeze to the point where there's social instability, then you better stop squeezing. And in fact, if you look at some of the electoral experiments, inter-party democracy out in Sichuan, you find that is the reason for that, is you have to bring in some new talent to repair relations with the local population. So that, in terms of social stability, has become really, I think, very important, and it is a certain check. I'm not so sure. There must be local factionalism. I don't hear a lot about that. There is certainly, let's see, I don't want to depict the local party secretary as simply doesn't have to talk to anybody. There are certainly local networks that you have to fit into. You know, I've asked people, you know, is it possible to be an honest party secretary? I said, no. If you did that, nobody would trust you. Actually, if you read there was New York Times a little while ago had an article on Serpico in the New York Police Department in the 70s, 60s, and the line there was exactly the same, that he wasn't trusted in the NYPD because he wasn't on the take. And I thought, oh boy, there are different places all around the world that follow basically the same rules. I'm in the wrong business, you know. But yeah, accountability are these sorts of issues, that if you can develop your local economy, maintain political stability, I think corruption is not something that is particularly a matter of concern if it's within certain bounds.
Petty corruption. What about village elections? You know, this, you know, it used to be a pretty big, you know, subject that attracts a lot of analytic attention. You know, you know, personally, I don't think it works. I mean, so what's your take on village elections?
The one I saw in March didn't work. I was out in Yunnan, out in the boonies, in March with the Carter Center. And I thought, if the Carter Center is observing an election, they ought to make one that looks pretty good. I went with the Carter Center 10 years ago to a different election. That one was much more effective, I thought, than this one. This one, it was actually the party secretary who was running for Zhenjiang, the township head position. So he was going to carry it both on one shoulder pole, as I say, yi jian tao, right? He'd already served in this position before, so he was well known, had bases of support. His opponent was head of one of the 27 natural villages that was under this administrative village, and had never served in any position that allowed him contact or administrative responsibility with the other 26 villages. So you just look at this and you make a prediction. I've become a very good political prognosticator in China. It's a little bit more difficult in the States. But in China, it was easy, and indeed, the party secretary won with over 90% of the vote. It was just totally uncompetitive. It didn't even make a good show. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the party hack, I think was the word you used, that's inside the private enterprise. Is that both domestic enterprises as well as foreign enterprises? And is this a source of considerable power and influence, or is it just the local fixer who's not going to go anywhere?
I don't think I used the word hack. He may or may not be. By the way, I discovered something about local party secretaries. They can talk 3 or 4 hours. They make us academics seem like wimps. Just absolutely talk in continuous, and it's always very logical, one point flowing from another, and none of it has any meaning at all. It's really quite remarkable talent. It's really amazing. I don't think he has a lot of power. He sits on the board of directors, and so there's undoubtedly a report back function. But as far as I could tell, he never voted against anything or influenced a decision. He doesn't know anything about running the business. And he was really pretty frank that he was there to support the business. And that includes, there are a lot of labor disputes in China, maybe particularly that part of China. And part of his job is to go out and say to the workers, look, we're all working together to build China economically. So suck it up.
So he doesn't have power really beyond his role in that?
Not that I could detect. Yeah, Andrew.
Last night I just finished watching the film The Last Train Home about migrant workers, which I thought was quite thought-provoking. I wonder, with some of the recent factory slowdowns in the Pearl River Delta, more of the migrants returning home, has that created an impact on the local politics in any of these remote areas you're discussing? Do people come in with...
Back into the interior, you mean?
Yes, exactly. Do people come with new ideas, heightened expectations, or are they just so overwhelmed and preoccupied with basic issues that it really doesn't have much of an impact?
Yeah, I don't have a very good feel for that is the bottom line. A lot of these people are not going back to their home villages, they're going back to the local township. And they are, at least some, they will either work in newly established factories, and they do bring certain skills, work skills to that job. So this actually may be a boon. I haven't checked the figures on this for interior industrialization.
TVs.
Yeah, exactly. That sort of enterprise. I don't think that it has any political impact. I haven't heard of anything like that.
It's not a question of, how do you keep them down on the farm after they've seen Shenzhen or something like that? Yeah, well, if the interior is intelligent, they will say, how do you tap the energy of these people? And a lot of them seem to be staying in those local townships. And that's, for the interior, this could be a good thing, not a bad thing. Wore you out?
Any other questions? Well, I've actually got one more, then I'll leave you with, which is, you've described really well this sort of top-down model of the way authority works and flows based on the relationships. And wondered whether there's any influence, bottom-up kind of influence as well. And the reason I wondered this is that one of the reasons given when you travel to China for the lack of resolution of their maritime boundary disputes, with fishing grounds in the East China Sea or the hydrocarbon issues in the East China Sea, same thing in the South China Sea, is that, well, we did this once, we did it in the Gulf of Tonkin, and it didn't go so well because we alienated all kinds of fishermen from the local region who had for millennia been able to fish in all the waters, and now we told them they can only fish in half.
Mm-hmm.
And that just made problems for the local party cadre, which made problems for the provincial and so forth and so on all the way up the chain. And so now we're just once bitten, twice shy in terms of these maritime boundary disputes. Is that an excuse to sort of gloss over the fact that they don't really want to resolve them anyway? Or is there in fact something to that there is a bottom-up pressure that can occasionally be effective?
There's a lake between Shandong and Jiangsu, straddles the boundary. They have not solved the border issue between Jiangsu and Shandong for 50 years. They've had different commissions, ministerial level, Zhou Enlai, Wenling. And of course, this isn't, well, part of it is that it does affect local villagers, but it also affects local party secretaries. They have not been able to solve that one for 50 years. So maybe your interlocutors there are not being entirely disingenuous. But for more continuous bottom-up import, a guy by the name of Lai Hairong wrote a book on semi-competitive elections in Sichuan, and it's got a ton of data and observed this thing for years. And they've done over 2,000 of these so-called inter-party elections at the township level in Sichuan. And he says not one of these is a result of bottom-up pressure. They're always because local cadres are facing one of these, it's either economic development or local stability. They've come into a crunch on that, and they're all in response to the problems of local officialdom, not in response to local demands. We want to be able to elect the local party secretary or something like that. So there's pretty limited input in any sort of mass sense. Okay.
Any last round? So I guess we got one.
What's the relationship between party secretaries and the administrators? Because we know a township has a zhenzang and a party secretary.
Mm-hmm.
A county also has a xianzang.
Yeah.
So what's the relationship?
Well, it's often contentious. But I think my understanding of the way this has been worked out, and you see this more at the provincial level, I think, but I think the same logic applies at lower levels. If you're a good governor of a province, in 3 or 5 years, you can be a party secretary of a different province. So there's a real incentive to bite your tongue, bide your time, and you will get your promotion, and then you can irritate your governor. That's my understanding, and I think the same thing really applies at the local level generally. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.